So without further ado, it gives me absolute great pleasure to introduce Mark Knight. Mark is an archaeologist with the Cambridge Archaeological Unit at the Department of Archaeology at the University of Cambridge. His research focus is the prehistory of the Cambridgeshire Fens and the deeply buried landscapes made accessible via commercial development and large-scale mineral extractions. Mark is going to introduce us to sites such as Bradley Fen and Must Farm, which represent key examples of his work. Mark, over to you and dispatches from beneath the peat, the Must Farm pile dwelling settlement. Thank you.
Thank you. What is archaeology? Or what is archaeology in the context of digging prehistory in Finland? I thought to answer this question, I would share my perspective on Fenland archaeology, one that comes from the bottom up, a standpoint, in this case literally, that focuses upon establishing the sequence of lived-on surfaces from the bottom to the top. My first image shows two surfaces, one that you can't quite see. It's the horizon that I'm stood on in the test pit. The second is the modern field surface. In the background, you can make out the grass-covered top of a mound or earthwork of a late Neolithic or early Bronze Age round barrow, one of several now emerging in the Nene washes. In the foreground is a test pit being hand excavated to reach the buried soil or old land surface contemporary with the round barrow's construction and use. What is clear from this image is that the prehistoric land surface is considerably deeper than the present-day grassy field. The difference is about 1.2 metres, or approximately 4,000 years. In reality, the distance between the two surfaces is shrinking. If we were to have dug this same test pit 100 years ago, it would have measured at least 2 metres deep, and you wouldn't have been able to see my balding head or have any idea that this part of Fenland was full of deeply buried burial monuments. My head and the crown of the barrow would have been obscured. The draining of the fens is an ongoing process, and with it so is the shrinking of the silts and peats that make it the flat agricultural landscape it is today. As the silts and peats dry out, they contract, or with continued ploughing and exposure, are quite literally blown away. The relationship between depth and time, or age and altitude, is why I prefer to excavate the fens. It is also because past lived-on surfaces are well preserved, and most importantly, kept separate by a sequence or succession of deposits laid down throughout the Holocene. As I will show, the Fenland sequence is commensurate with later prehistory. Another way to illustrate this dynamic is to move further out into the Fenland Basin, where the preserving cover is even deeper. My second slide shows a section through the sediment sequence of a different part of Fenland, the Silt Fen north of Thorney, at the border between Cambridgeshire and Lincolnshire. Here you get a proper sense of depth. The section is very close to being 3 metres deep. The bulk of the section is made up of marine silts, the blues, oranges and browns, laid down at the very beginning of the Bronze Age when the sea inundated this part of Fenland, either as tidal mudflats or tidal creeks. Importantly, at the very base of this deep section is a buried soil or old land surface. It's the 20 centimetre thick, dark grey, sandy loam separated from the marine silts by a thin, dark humic horizon. The height of this surface is 3 metres below sea level. And if we go in closer, you can see that buried soil, you can see that humic horizon that sits over the top of it, and then the marine or the thin buttery clay over the top. We grabbed a portion of this buried soil and put it on the top of the surface and hand sorted it and pulled out 4 Neolithic worked flints. So this is a single hole down through metres of sediment. We find the old land surface and then we find artifacts within it. And this is what that test pit looked like on the surface. And you can see that there's nothing to show. There's no sense of what the paleotopography is or where the sites are. It's just a big flat Fenland field, which we use a machine to punch these holes into and try and characterize the paleotopography and the sediment sequence. And by doing multiple test pits, we're able to create these profiles, and we can trace the buried soil of the old land surface in its relationship to the subsequent Holocene sediment sequence. So the lower peat and the fen clay and the big rodents or the old paleochannels of the sort of tidal creeks that once crossed this part of Fenland. And on the same slide, you can see test pit 40. You can see its profile being reproduced, and the old land surface down at 3 meters below sea level, and the number of worked flint we found in that location. So this is a way of characterizing Fenland. It's what I call digging small holes to find the big. And in my presentation today, I'm going to carry on with that thing, but also think about digging big holes to find the small. So we're not the first people to explore the Holocene sequence, and we can go back to 1935 and the Fenland Research Committee and Graham Clark and Harry Godwin, and back to the sort of, I suppose, the sort of flagship site of Fenland, which is Peacock's Farm. And this is where the Fenland Research Committee sunk a trench into the deep fen, and were able to articulate the Holocene sequence of the lower peat, the buttery clay or fen clay, and the upper peat. But more importantly, and this is what Clark called his sort of delicate chronological scale, he was able to articulate that sequence in relationship to archaeological deposits. So at the base, where it says this black band, he found Mesolithic worked flint. And then just above that, in another layer, he found early Neolithic pottery. And then higher up again, above the fen clay, he found early Bronze Age pottery and flint. And this was the first time, and you have to remember this is pre-radiocarbon dating, where artifact typologies were actually articulated in sequence vertically through archaeological stratigraphy. So there's a sense here of a sort of verification of how we were understanding past material culture. But at the same time, Clark and Godwin realized that there was another dynamic going on here, which is the gradient, or the edge of the fens, which was basically this relationship between age and altitude, but also what they called the surface available for settlement. So in effect, we start off with a landscape in the Mesolithic that has a small layer of peat, but lots of land. And then we end up by the early Bronze Age with a little bit of land and a lot of peat and silt. So there's this sense of this sort of time transgressive landscape as we watch basically the lower contours disappear beneath sediment. And if we look closer at this section, you can see something else, and it's another artifact that doesn't get talked about as much. But can you see that there's a stump of a preserved oak tree sitting on the old land surface and subsumed by the marine sediment? And then above that marine sediment, in the early part of the upper peat, there's a tree stump of a willow tree. And here we are actually seeing that same succession or development of the landscape in terms of that time transgressive environment. So we're seeing terrestrial woodland being replaced by wet woodland. And in a way, this is the sort of book that we take out into the fens, or the image that we take out into the fens at Moss Farm in our trying to articulate that same sort of dynamic, the relationship between the gradient and the deposition of sediment, or that time transgressive environment. So this is Moss Farm Quarry. And as you can see straight away, that the section in the background is the equivalent to Peacock's Farm. See the lower peat, the fen clay, and the upper peat. You can also see the gradient of the natural. And in a way, I feel like within the aperture of the quarry, we're able to repeat what the Fenland Research Committee did in a single trench over and over again as the quarry progresses across the landscape. To the extent that we even find the oak trees, the bog oaks, sitting at that same interface between the lower peat and the fen clay. And we also find tree stumps and branches of the same tree where they've been trimmed and been worked, and wood chips. So there's a real sense here of activity on the edge in the later Neolithic. And the great thing about bog oaks is that they are there to be dated. They can be looked at by dendrochronologists, and we can start looking at when they started growing, but also when they died. So we can put that into our understanding or our articulation of that sediments or the stratigraphy. So our mantra on site basically is see tree, slice tree, and we've taken over now 80 samples from these bog oaks, and we've had these processed by Ian Tyers, and we're now being able to show that these oaks are datable between, or growing between, around 2600 BC and 2300 BC. And in effect, they're dating the arrival of the sea. So oaks can tolerate getting their feet wet, but they cannot tolerate a marine environment. The salt water kills them dead. So we're seeing this sort of environmental event being recorded in the death of all these trees. So that's the quarry, that's our sort of aperture, our window, and the landscape it takes us into is the Fenland Basin. And if I grab the laser pointer, just over here we can see the island of Whittlesea. We can see the Nene coming out of Northamptonshire through Peterborough and debouching into the Fenland Basin. And that little embayment there is the Flag Fen Basin, which is where the Moss Farm quarry is and where we spend a lot of our time basically excavating these earlier landscapes. And what this map shows is obscuration. This is from the Inglade project from the University of Oxford, where they basically showed where the ground cover is so dense that you cannot use aerial photography or geophysical survey. It's an area of 100% obscuration. There's no real way of getting at detecting what kinds of sites live or exist beneath these deposits. So it's a sense of a blank zone. But also, as I've just shown in my earlier slides, it's a place that's got depth. It's also got preservation. So this is the Flag Fen Basin, and it's a combination here of the landscape that we excavate, as in the later Bronze Age landscape, but also overlain with the sort of the place names of modern Peterborough and modern Whittlesea. So you can see Whittlesea Island, and you can see Fengate, the sort of industrial estate of Peterborough itself, and Stand Ground. And then you can see the Flag Fen Basin, and then you can see our paleo channel winding its way through, and you can see where the site of Must Farm is. So I want to give a little bit of context, really, I suppose, in the sense that if you dig a small hole in the fens, 9 times out of 10 it will do this. It will fill with water. It's the bonus of this place in terms of its preservation, hence why we get all the organic preservation. We can find things like wood, but also obviously it's an inhibitor in the sense that if you're not careful, you'll drown, or the sides will collapse, or it's not an easy place to access the archaeology itself. So how do we get past that? How do we get to see these deeply buried landscapes, and how do we get to see them at scale without being basically underwater? Well, of course, my answer is the Moss Farm quarry, the brick pit. This is the biggest hole in Fenland, and it's our window on the deep deposits. So what you've got here is the working quarry. So at the base is the Jurassic clay that's being mined for brick making. You can then see the Pleistocene gravels, but everything above that gravel band is the Holocene. And we've even got the lower peat, the fen clay, and the upper peat sequence. And then we've got big cuts of paleo channels, basically the prehistoric Nene cutting through the quarry as well. So their endeavour to get deep allows us to get deep too, but we're not going to the depths that they're after. So we stay dry and we get this accessible approach to the archaeology itself. The other thing to say about this section is that it's got a big smile in it. You can just see here, which is the Moss Farm Paleo Channel. And the Moss Farm Paleo Channel is the context of the Moss Farm pile dwelling settlement. So you'll notice that a lot of my slides feature this same sort of contour. You see the edge, you see the lower peat, the fen clay, and the upper peat. And in that sequence, you can see the position of the Moss Farm Rodden, and then its freshwater channel sat in the top, which is the context of much of our investigation. You can also see that the time transgressive environment that we're working within goes through freshwater and marine phases. So there's a sense here of environmental impact. So that oak tree that I showed you that we take samples from the bog oak sits round about here. So this is our paleo channel. So the pale grey silts is the Rodden, and the darker grey silts is the freshwater channel. And it gives you a sense of scale and how we're able to approach it. So we started digging the Moss Farm Paleo Channel in 2009 properly, and finished excavating it in 2016 with the pile dwelling settlement. And this is off-site from the pile dwelling settlement. This is over adjacent to it. And this is where basically we were able to dig 320 meters of the paleochannel in its entirety and understand it. So what you've got here is a freshwater channel that is slow moving, sluggish, the sediment's dropping very gently. There's nothing erosive about it at all. It dates to about 1600 BC at the bottom and 100 BC at the top. And everything that basically gets deposited in this channel, we're able to excavate. The other thing to say about sediment of the paleochannel is that it's non-porous. So it's just beautiful at preserving wet things within its context. It's not wet itself, but it doesn't allow water to escape or air to enter. So in 2009, we started looking at the paleochannel and start to realize its potential, I suppose, because the first things we were finding with the metal detector were Bronze Age weapons. So things like the spear, but as always at Must Farm, it also comes with the spear shaft still attached. And then this leaf-shaped sword from a similar context within the paleochannel. And to the point where in that 320 meters, we found multiple metal items, including things towards the bottom, such as this rapier, the leaf-shaped sword in the middle, and then right at the top where the peat was forming, we were finding these late Iron Age iron swords. So almost like harping back to Peacock's farm and this idea of material culture being articulated in its temporal sequence, the same happens with the paleochannel. So in that 320 meters, we excavated, we were able to find 10 fish weirs. This is one of them. You can see that basically it's preserved, it's a chevron shaped. You can see where the stakes have fallen over and the waterwork going along it. And in association with the fish weirs, we also found 24 fish traps or eel traps. And these were located along that same length of channel. All of these were coming back to radiocarbon dates for sort of 1600, 1500 Cal BC. And they all sit at the early stage of that sediment sequence. In that same profile, we found the remains or complete versions of 9 log boats. And here's 2 of them. You can just see the level of preservation and their context and relationship to the profile of the channel, and also some of the excavation methods as well. So in total, we found 9 log boats, 7 of which were Bronze Age and 2 of which were Iron Age. And these were sort of almost evenly sort of dotted through that vertical section. So a sense here that the channel was a busy place. And a nice thing about this slide is that you can see where it's rained, the channel is starting to refill with water, so you get a sense of its scale. And I suppose that's the other thing about Fenland archaeology is that it's this absence of truncation and this sense of absence of palimpsest. Everything seems to be in sequence and there's very little in the way of intrusiveness. So unlike a sort of sites that are much closer to the surface where the Roman archaeology intrudes on the Iron Age archaeology that then intrudes on the Bronze Age archaeology, here sediment keeps things apart. So there's a real sense of things are still in place. It's quite eerie, really, in terms of excavating it. You feel like the people haven't long left the site. So the sediment sequence is different from the profiles I showed you earlier in the sense that obviously there's no buried soil. These are fluvial silts. This is a river channel. And it's difficult to think of surfaces, lived on surfaces or surfaces available for settlement. But in a way, I think that we're starting to change that now. We're starting to consider these wet deposits as also places of intensive activity. So whether it's fishing or canoeing or the deposition of metalwork and things, it's all part of that story. And on the base of this slide, you can see the profile through that same section through the paleochannel and the complexity of the sediments and things. So this is a plan of the 2009-2012 excavations of the paleochannel. You can see our giant bolts going across it. You can see the location of the log boats and the fish weirs and all of the different artifacts that came out of its profile. And what it demonstrates really is that it's a busy place. And now you have to remember that this channel goes on for kilometers. We're the first people to investigate it at any scale. We open 320 meters and we find 9 log boats. So there's a sense here that this is telling us something about the rest of the channel beyond the confines of the quarry pit. So if we go from the paleochannel to the pile dwelling site, we can see that all we have to do is travel downstream a couple of 100 meters, and we can basically visit the pole dwelling itself. The thing to remember about the pole dwelling site is that it's higher up the profile from the fish weirs and the fish traps. There's a bit like the test pit I showed at the beginning. There's a separation in depth and also a separation in time. So the same river silts that we excavated around the log boats and the fish traps and the metalwork, we also excavated from around the remains of the architecture of the pole dwelling settlement. And this is, I suppose, quite a classic slide now of the Moss Farm pole dwelling settlement excavations. It really does demonstrate our methodology. You notice that we spent most of our time laying on a front on muddy planks, and you'll notice that there are no mattocks or shovels. In fact, there's barely a tool in sight, and most of the excavation was done with the tips of your fingers or a little wooden clay modeling tool. There's that sense of trying to expose the sort of density or the complexity of the settlement remains. So here's a bigger picture of the settlement itself. So just so you know, this is the southern bank of the river running along here, and you can see it's marked by the palisade that enclosed the settlement. The center of the channel is about here, and then you can see the remains of individual structures. You can see the rafter fans of individual roofs and the circles of individual stilted roundhouses. And I've just put up in the corner a picture of the temporary warehouse that we put up, of which this excavation is occurring within, just to give you a sense of the environment that we spent 12 months within. So the same sluggish silts that protected the log boats from the fish weirs is also the matrix of this settlement. It's just that we're higher up in the profile itself. We've lost half the settlement to the quarry, so the old quarry edge disappears off here. So here's that same image, but in plan. This is a photogrammetric image of the settlement. You can see a modern pipe trench cut through the settlement here. You can see the quarries taking away this part of the settlement. And then you can see the palisade running along the edge of the river itself. And then you get the impression of the individual structures. You can see the spokes and the wheels, basically the rafters of individual houses. And here's the plan of our encounter with the Moss Farm pole dwelling settlement. So what is it? It's a mass of charred and waterlogged wood. And the majority of the horizontal timbers you can see are charred, and the majority of the uprights, almost every single one, are unburnt, and they're just preserved through being waterlogged. So it tells us something about the dynamics of the end of the settlement and its collapse. You'll also notice that amongst all of the wooden beams and timber elements and things, there's the silhouette of a wooden wheel just here, which also occurs in our distribution of material culture. So I've pushed the wooden architectural elements back and brought forward all of the material culture, including things like the animal bone assemblage. So you get a sense of the complexity that we were dealing with and trying to understand the sort of the mess, I suppose, of architectural remains and contents of the settlement. So this is the plan of the collapsed settlement, and then this is our understanding or interpretation of the actual layout of the settlement. So you can see the palisade is something that we can trace all the way through that sequence. You see how it basically encompasses the settlement. And then you can see within that, we identified 5 structures, 4 of which were round and 1 of which was square or rectangular. We were also able to identify a central walkway, a light structural walkway running around the inside of the palisade, and then with concentrations of material culture and animal bone, the beginnings of formative middens, filling in the holes or forming halos around the footprints of the structures themselves. So in excavating the site, we had a sense of basically beneath structures and around structures. So around the structures, we found these deposits, which we called formative middens. They were mostly made up of fragmented material culture, so broken pots and butchered animal bone and burnt stones and things. But mostly the material culture itself was unburnt. it had been deposited before the settlement had caught fire and burnt down. Whereas within the footprints of the individual structures, we found complete objects like pots and wooden artifacts that were almost wholly burnt or fire damaged, but often in a complete state. So we had this sort of division between material that was being deposited during the lifetime of the settlement and material that was deposited at the point of the conflagration. So our excavation really was about trying to disentangle that contextual mess, really, trying to understand how things related and what was the sort of toponymy, I suppose, of the deposition sequence. So here you get a sense of the sort of jumble, really. You can see there's a complete pot, there's an upturned wooden trough, there's a wooden bucket, there's some architectural elements with mortise and tenon joints, there's bits of the roof, bits of clay and turf and things. So this is the story of the excavation, really. And the thing to say about that deposit is that it had no depth. So remember the big section I showed you through the Paleo channel, we were able to show you river sediment successively building up. Well, our settlement had a single layer in effect, and it was this deposit. So beneath it was river channel sediments, and above it was river channel sediments. And in this sort of 10 to 21 centimetre thick layer was all of the remains of the settlement itself. And we were visited during the excavation by Professor Stephanie Jacquemet from the Circumalpine region, from Bern University, who's been used to digging Neolithic pile-dwelling settlements in Switzerland. And she just said, "You lucky buggers," she said, basically, that we were able to have such clarity over our stratigraphy. She was used to sections like this, where 100 years of settlement was basically a series of very fine laminations. And they were there trying to identify single occupations, whereas all we had was a single layer. But there was complexity to that single layer. So not only was there this sort of spatial difference between what was beneath the footprints of the buildings and what was around them, but also, and very fortunately for us, there was a sense that where things fell was pretty much where they had been above the river before they were deposited. So, for example, on the riverbed, we found the wood chips of construction. So what you can see in front of you is some of the piles, but also these blonde-looking wood chips here. These are fragments of where the ash piles have been trimmed, ready to be inserted into the riverbed. And the black ones are the oak wood chips. And again, it's part of the same process. And our understanding of the channel is that it was so sluggish, so stagnant, and so heavily vegetated that it basically acted like a hairbrush. So if things dropped into it, they pretty much stayed where they fell. So this is a distribution of those wood chips relative to the settlement. And what was interesting about it was that if there were ash uprights, they tended to be ash wood chips. If there were oak uprights, they tended to be oak wood chips. And this gave us real confidence about all the other aspects of deposition or spatial pattern. So, for example, I've plotted here all the oak piles. So this is the sort of footprint of the settlement. This is it laying out, really. So you can see the oak piles are basically set out the alignment of the palisade, but also you can see the structures starting to form. And the oak piles look like the two here. So this one and this one. And you can see these are basically whole trees that have been felled. They've had their branches trimmed, but beyond that, there's very little conversion. And then they've been driven into the river silts. And then in turn, added to that oak layout was the ash palisade and the supplementary stakes for the individual structures. So you can see there's a real sort of plan about the way the settlement's been constructed. And this is a close-up of the ash palisade. I'm seeing it under excavation as well. So you can see the preservation is just tremendous. So in looking at that sort of formality of the architecture, what's really interesting is that you can see that the predominant wood used in the construction of the settlement is oak and ash, and also that there's a sort of uniformity or formalization in its use within each of the structures. There's something here that says that this isn't ad hoc. This is a well-practiced architecture, something that people were used to, was accomplished, which gives me sort of confidence that we're not digging some kind of anomaly, but we're actually digging pattern. And this is a reconstruction image by Judith Dobie from Historic England. And it's really this idea that the wood used in the construction of the settlement came from a terrestrial source. It's not from the fen itself. It's oak and ash. And these are young trees, maybe 40, 50 years old when they're being felled to be made into the settlement. So it's almost as if maybe there's a sort of slight sense here of pre-planning or managed woodland or something like that. So if we go back to structure one, this is it in plan. You can see that we've got I've highlighted the palisade, the light structure or palisade walkway. I've also shown the oak uprights of structure one, the outer ring and the inner ring, and then you can see the rafters of the roof where they've collapsed. And here, what's important is that we cut slices through these for dendrochronology in the hope that we might get a construction date and understand something about the sequence of building and things. But unfortunately, the tree rings fall out of the known reference. So Ian wasn't able to say it was built in this year, but what he was able to say with great confidence was that all of the trees built in the construction of the settlement were all felled in the same year. So what he called his year zero. And the other thing he said was that the nature of the timbers that he was able to date, where they'd been burnt, he felt that there was a distortion that suggested that the wood was still green at the point of the conflagration. So he was suggesting that they hadn't been seasoned. And oak takes 12 months or so to season. So his suggestion was that our settlement was constructed as one, and within 9 to 12 months, it was burnt down as one. So suddenly we had this brevity or foreshortened window on the duration of our settlement. And at the same time, we were perhaps giving some sort of validation to our understanding of the stratigraphy as well, that that simplicity or lack of depth and the formative nature of the middens was also being reflected in our understanding of the tree rings and the construction of the settlement itself. So here's a pile dwelling. This is a crannog. This is Loch Tay. I don't know if you guys remember, but in 2021, it burnt down. It caught fire, and within 6 minutes, it was gone. And I use this slide really as a sort of sense of reconstruction. So the sort of temporality of the settlement might be 12 to 9 months, but the duration of its destruction might have only been a matter of minutes. And we can see the remnants of the Loch Tay reconstructed crannog and how it looks. And then we can compare that to our settlement. So this is structure one again. You can see there's a real sense here of similarity or parallel. Here is the collapsed structure in the bottom of the riverbed. So again, that thin stratigraphy is very apparent in here. You can see as we're removing quarters of the building, we can start to see what's beneath the roof. These are the roof rafters. You can see the wood chips over here, and you can start seeing the remnants of the wattle floors. So in terms of our understanding of the construction of structure one or all of the buildings is that we have a double ring of posts with floor joists and a light wattle floor, and then ring beams going around the uprights, and then rafters and purlins. And it's a very simple sort of cone and cylinder construction with a very heavy roof, but very light floors and walls sat above a small watercourse, looking something like this in profile. And you can see these bold joists that we found. So we found these sort of narrow diameter, sort of alder and willow poles that had been driven into the riverbed and bent over to create these sort of springy floors. And this is a reconstruction by Neath Shepherd, and you can see here the